Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this conversation on the use of the 3.5 gigahertz band in the US with CBRS and the new regulatory regime for spectrum sharing. This is part of a report by Sense of Healing collaboration with RCR Wireless. And today with me, I have Mark Gibson, who is the Senior Director of Business Development at CommScope. Mark, thanks for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So this is a very exciting topic. It's becoming very hot, and but let's start to provide some background. What is that you're doing at CommScope in this area?
Well, my job at CommScope under the business development is to bring basically the SaaS concept into CommScope, get us working on building it, and making it available to our customers. My role in business development sort of spans a combination of business development and technical business development. So I've been responsible for working within the Wireless Innovation Forum and within the CBRS Alliance, as well as with the FCC, to interpret what those organizations are prescribing in terms of rules and requirements, and then help interpret that for us along the lines of what it means for us to develop our SaaS.
Right. You mentioned SaaS. What is the SaaS? That's an entirely new creation.
Yes, that is a new creation. The SaaS is a spectrum access system, and it got its start back in 2010 out of the President's Council and Advisors of Science and Technology, PCAST. PCAST existed, probably still does, under the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy. And by virtue of then President Obama's search for 500 megahertz, the president issued a memorandum urging the government to find 500 megahertz of spectrum to make available for commercial use. So PCAST developed a report, and in that report they described two concepts. One was the three-tier concept of spectrum sharing, which I can describe in more detail in a moment. And the other was the concept of a spectrum access system, or a SaaS, that will help support the whole sharing concept. So the three-tier and the SaaS really are what makes CBRS, the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, applicable here in the United States.
Now, I understand that CommScope has been approved to be a SaaS.
Yes, CommScope submitted an application through the CommSearch division, which is where I came in. CommSearch division came into CommScope through the acquisition of Andrew Corporation. And CommSearch's background as a brand had been in the world of spectrum management, which is where I am. So when the FCC issued a public notice associated with the rulemaking that set up the rules for the CBRS, we being CommScope, were interested in becoming a SaaS provider. We were a provider in the early days of TV whitespace, and in fact, we were one of the at least conditionally approved TV whitespace database operators. So we believe in the new world of spectrum management, so to speak, with dynamic spectrum sharing or dynamic spectrum management. So the spectrum access system that's being described and being considered within the CBRS is, we thought, a brand new, widely adopted, so to speak, or certainly widely interesting new way to share spectrum. And so CommScope submitted an application to be a spectrum access system or a SaaS provider, as well as another concept, which we can get into a little bit later, called the ESC, or the Environmental Sensing Capability. So we submitted an application to be both, and on December 16th last year, we were conditionally approved to go forward into the next round, which is the actual testing and certification, which is expected to begin, we think, in about July timeframe.
Now, in terms of, I will ask you about the timing a little bit later, but
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about, in the sense of the ecosystem, how does a SaaS work with the rest of the ecosystem? Because again, this is an entirely new creation in the sense that in a licensed spectrum, you own your spectrum, you use it whichever way you want. Unlicensed, everybody's using it, but nobody's coordinating. So the SaaS comes in the middle of those two and tries to get some order, some some fair way of sharing the resources. So how do you interact with the other parties in the ecosystem?
Well, that's an excellent question, because there are several parties in the ecosystem, and a lot of that interaction has been sort of laid out from a regulatory perspective by the FCC, and to a lesser extent the NTIA, because we have to deal with military radars. So at a high level, the role of the SAS is to sort of mitigate among the various users within a spectrum, within this pyramidal concept. So going back to describing this pyramid, and again, this is right out of the PCAST report. At the top of the pyramid, the peak, is what is the incumbents. And this would work for any band where you have sharing like this. The incumbents in this band, there are three real basic incumbents. There's the government operations, which are primarily DoD. Then there's a middle layer, which is called priority access. I'll explain what that is in a moment. And then there's the bottom layer, which is called GAA, or General Authorized Access. And so what the SAS is supposed to do is, and each of those, by the way, within that hierarchy, and the reason they're arranged that way is the hierarchical relationship. The reason and so what the SAS is supposed to do is to allow for the various hierarchies to maintain their spectrum rights as it relates to the ones right below them on the hierarchical pyramid. So at the top of the list, as I said, was the incumbents. And again, those are the fixed satellite guys, the general broadband WISP operations that are in the 3650 to 3700. And then across the entire band, 3550 to 3700 is the radars, and there's several types of them. So, and then again, there's the middle layer, which is the priority access layer, or PAL. The PAL layer is the spectrum is made available through an auction process that the FCC has yet to describe. But the users of that spectrum are considered priority users, hence the name priority access. And then the lower layer, or GAA, is the general authorized access. And those are considered to be pseudo-unlicensed, although we maintain they are licensed, and they're perhaps licensed light. They're licensed, essentially licensed by rule, but they do have the difference primarily between them being licensed and unlicensed is they do get protection among each other. But anyhow, what the SAS is supposed to do is to allow for the various layers to be able to have spectrum exclusively below the layers beneath them. So in other words, the incumbent layer gets protected across the entire band. The PAL gets protected for GAA, and GAA gets no protection at all, except for each other. And so that's what the SAS is supposed to do, is to provide for the spectrum assurance, if you will, for the various layers of operation within that hierarchy.
Right, so you'll be working with the basically whoever owns the infrastructure primarily, and you also have to interact with the other SAS in the market, right?
That's right. So it's interesting. There is still some question as to the use cases and potential customers. We do know by virtue of our interaction with them that at least the tier 1 carriers are interested. In fact, most of the carriers have some interest. If you can look at, I mentioned at the top of the discussion that there's two organizations, they're multi-stakeholder groups that are helping with the standards and recommendations. One of them is the CBRS Alliance, and the other is the Wireless Innovation Forum. And I know that all the top tier 1 carriers, the 4 tier 1 carriers, are members of the CBRS Alliance. And I believe that all the tier 1 carriers are members of the Wireless Innovation Forum. So those are obviously, and you can read this in various publications, including RCR, are the users, are the prescriptive users of the spectrum. In other words, they want access to the 150 megahertz that this band will be making available. So they will be obviously customers of most people, who we're hoping us as well. But there are other users as well. Because of the GAA aspect of it, the priority layer, the PAL layer, seems to be of interest to those that are looking for exclusive licensed spectrum, and that would be primarily the carriers. That's usually their business operations. But the GAA is a brand new concept that certainly is open for anybody. In fact, the restrictions on being able to get access to that band are very limited. In fact, in an early version of the FCC's rulemaking, they thought that healthcare would be an interesting primary GAA user. So they were actually thinking of healthcare facilities being possibly users of that spectrum through a SAS concept. So the SAS those will service those entities, but because the FCC entertained applications and at least conditionally granted applications from 7 SAS providers, then all of the SAS providers have to interoperate with each other. And interoperate means that we have to be able to share information with each other. And the FCC has described what that information is. It starts with having to share information on grant information, and then there's other information, that's kind of very particular. But the SASs actually have to cooperate with the sharing of information. And the FCC describes, at least from a regulatory perspective, how that has to be done. And then the Wireless Innovation Forum has been working to describe the process in terms of requirements related to data that gets exchanged, as well as protocols. So that kind of describes the ecosystem of who would be interoperating with the SAS. And of course, the FCC gets involved. And then there's this thing called the ESC, which I'll talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, so there is a question here of trying to find a fair way to allocate the spectrum resources, which is brand new because we have never done it before. So a lot of it is sort of trying to experiment and see what works. So the FCC is playing a role, but then there is the work with the Wind Forum and the CBRS Alliance to create some consensus. How is that working out, do you think? Do you think that it's going to be easy to find a consensus among all the different players in the ecosystem?
Well, the terms easy and consensus are usually not used in the same sentence together. I would say that there is desire to have all parties that are working in this realm, whether they be PAL or GAA, to collaborate on what is meant by coexistence and spectrum etiquette. The FCC says that the SASs are supposed to service the customers, or service the users, not customers, service users on a non-discriminatory basis. And so that means many things to many people. Wireless Innovation Forum, which we call the WIN Forum, has been working on etiquette and ensuring fairness and equity across the ecosystem, so to speak. And the CBRS Alliance has also been doing the same. And it really boils down to this notion of coexistence. Which is a complicated concept at best, and at worst it's intractable, but we're not there yet, obviously. There is general agreement among all parties that are participating on trying to come up with framework to allow for fairness in grants, recognizing the various layers of spectrum rights that we have established, the FCC's established by virtue of our pyramid. And that really exists, obviously, between the CBRS users, that would be the PAL and the GAA guys. So within the CBRS Alliance and the WIN Forum, and this work does overlap a little bit, but it has sort of been bifurcated into the two groups. More or less, the CBRS Alliance is dealing with this more on a technology-specific basis, whereas the WIN Forum is dealing with it more on a technology-agnostic basis. But we're trying to sort of untangle the Gordian knot of spectrum assurance and spectrum etiquette and parity, if you will, within just the general framework of what coexistence means. And I don't mean to sort of weasel word it, but it's complex, and it's really, we're at the early stages of this right now. We all believe that we will sort this out, and we do have a fairly good way of doing that. A lot of us are really, hip deep in this and working pretty hard on it. And we're confident that within both of these organizations, we can describe a process that's working. One of the things that's been proposed, I believe it was in the WIN Forum, but I also think it's being proposed within the CBRS Alliance, is something called a Coexistence Manager. That actually sits out a little bit more local to where the cells or the CBSDs are actually operating, and helps manage the coexistence of the systems or the CBSDs that talk to that Coexistence Manager. You can consider it, for all intents and purposes, some may argue with this concept, but you consider it sort of the domain proxy on steroids. And so again, the details of how that will work out are being hashed out through both the WIN Forum and the CBRS Alliance. And they're even bringing into their concepts of listen before talk and other spectrum etiquette that's sort of beyond the regulatory considerations that we have, things that are being used both within, for example, the sharing within the 5 gig band between LTE and Wi-Fi. So we're sort of trying to take the best of all the worlds and put it into this coexistence concept within the Coexistence Manager to ensure parity and fairness.
Yeah, and that's very important to find the best way to optimize the use of spectrum resources by coordinating. Right. And I guess we can go and talk a little bit about the ESC in terms of that's yet another layer, if you will, to manage and understand how spectrum is being used.
Well, the ESC, I think many of us believe that it is a necessary evil. And I don't want to overplay that, but we don't like the concept of the ESC. We think that it's there because it has to be, largely because the government users don't want to interact with the SAS as a user. In other words, they want to have this ESC sort of give them an air gap, frankly, between the operations of their systems and how that's dealt with within the SAS. So we set up this ESC, which stands for Environmental Sensing Capability. And the intent of the ESC is to establish a network of sensors up and down the coasts and in the Gulf region that will sense the operation of shipborne radar systems, and then with some detection methodology, and then inform the SAS that a detection event has occurred, and then the SAS has to react accordingly. And the rules currently say that the SAS, I believe, has to shut down devices so as to not cause interference into the shipborne radars. So us SAS and ESC providers, mostly ESC providers, are working. A lot of this work, again, is going on within the Wireless Innovation Forum, working on how we do that. What is the detection threshold? How does the ESC work? How does the ESC trigger? How does the ESC inform? And for many of us, we will then be building a network of some 100+ sensors to actually affect this operation. And that's basically how it works. We're hopeful, frankly, before we spend a lot of money on this, that we can come up perhaps with another solution. Nonetheless, we're all committed to building an ESC to the extent we need to. And so that's kind of the basic concept of it. CommScope is working on sensor technology and how that sensor will be deployed, and how that deployed network will then interact with our SAS through what we're calling an ESC core. And so, we're kind of just at the beginning of that. We are getting new information coming within the WIN forum on how the ESC actually is supposed to do detection within the framework of the rules as we have them. And so there's been some changes that have been proposed within the WIN forum. These are good changes, but these cause us to be having to kind of go back and look at some of the technical aspects of what we're doing. So it's a dynamic environment, which is good because it's dynamic spectrum management. So it's not only dynamic spectrum management, but dynamic spectrum management framework.
Right, and now let's sort of look at beyond the US, because this it's dynamic spectrum management. In the US, it's going to be 3.5, the first target. But clearly, there is much more going on. It's sort of at the global level, it's sort of a proof of concept that we can share spectrum in commercial deployments or wide deployments. How do you see that working in terms of moving beyond the US? There is already something going on. There's already spectrum sharing in other countries, but it's not quite as wide. What's your view of that?
Well, the notion of the spectrum sharing, the way we're doing it here, is sort of domestic only in terms of this 3-tier concept. But spectrum sharing systems have been proposed and actually have been in use for some time in the LSA, or the License Shared Access concept. That's not been widely adopted. It is being used in parts of Europe, France, and Germany, I believe, in Italy. They're different. In fact, there is some contention between the analog between the 3-tier concept and the 2-tier concept. But all that aside, if you just look at the notion of dynamically shared spectrum, whether it be through SAS or LSA, there is some consistency, at least in an approach and a belief in that, notwithstanding the 3-tier versus 2-tier thinking. And so those of us that are doing this are hoping that there's a potential international market for this approach. And we also believe that this SAS approach represents at least the first generation of a brand new way to manage spectrum, at least manage spectrum on a dynamic basis. Searches through CommScope's history has been, we've got 40 years of actually doing what we call command and control frequency coordination, where people send in requests for frequencies. We go through a frequency interference analysis. We identify frequencies and configurations, and then we send the information back out to the user or the customer. That process can take as long as 30 days to go through its various iterations and gyrations. And so, we think that the SAS concept can shorten that appreciably. In fact, grants in SAS can happen in as little as seconds. So that sort of represents sort of the two arms, if you will, of how spectrum can be managed. And so we strongly believe that the SAS concept, once it gets proven here in the United States, and possibly the rest of region too as well, we know that Canada has been thinking about this, and we also hear that Mexico is thinking about it. And so IT region two, there be consistency at least across the region. And so we are hopeful that, and are sort of pushing the bounds, so to speak, in other parts of the world where the SAS concept can be adopted. Ofcom had made some forays into this area about 2 years ago. I believe they had a consultation asking about that, and we all commented on that. And that tracks kind of where Whitespace did it. Not that SAS and spectrum sharing like this are very similar to Whitespace, although there is some similarity, at least in terms of the concept. But if you look at Whitespace sort of as the progenitor of SAS, it was adopted in the United States, and then in Canada, and then in Ofcom, and in the UK, and then other parts of the world. And so, again, as the forebearer, if you will, of SAS, if that's any indication, albeit unlicensed, we think that there is a very strong possibility and framework established within the United States that can be taken to other countries. And so we're hoping that sooner than later that'll happen, across at least Europe and possibly parts of Africa and the Far East.
How pervasive do you think it's going to be? Because right now, most of the spectrum is licensed. There is some unlicensed. How important do you think the sort of the Spectrum Access Act, the shared spectrum regime is going to be moving forward? And
go ahead. Say that again, the last part.
Within which time frame? Is it going to happen in the next 3 years, 20 years?
Well, we think it's critical. Obviously, we have a sort of dog in the race, and so that's probably why we think it's critical. However, the reason it's been well adopted in the United States is primarily it facilitates sharing in bands where the incumbent is not necessarily, how shall I say, a willing participant. In other words, what we've got here with the DoD in the 3.5 gig band. And in situations where the spectrum is being used, say, by an incumbent like the DoD, infrequently. And so this is a really very good place to start. And if you remember from the beginning of the FCC's rulemaking, they called this the innovation band. So the commission and others are thinking that we will work out many of the bugs in this, and that's a lot of what's happening within the various multi-stakeholder groups, to take this concept a little bit with bugs worked out into other parts of the world. So if we don't necessarily have to have the 3-tier framework for this to be workable in other parts of the world. But if you think about the efficiencies, if one thinks about the efficiencies of spectrum management with a very light regulatory framework, and the spectrum being managed ultimately by something that looks like a spectrum access system, it may ultimately never look like what we have here. And it could be that the SAS becomes sort of a provider of data to something that's closer to the edge of the network, kind of like maybe our Coexistence manager that we've been thinking about. You're actually now being able to put the spectrum to much better real-time use. And while there's some controversy around the concept of use it or share it, and we understand the concept and we agree with some of the issues on it, ultimately, if we can work out a regulatory framework that respects the use it or share it, at least supports use it or share it, and can establish it in other parts of the world in license bands where people that may have a license but not maybe using it have some freedom to make that spectrum available to other parties, whether it's on a lease basis or just on an opportunistic basis. That's much more easily accomplished using a dynamics mechanism like a SAS than trying to do it through a command and control basis. And so we think that the SAS concept will open up large swaths of spectrum using that methodology, and a lot better than it would be trying to go back through a hardcore regulatory process where spectrum is allocated on a exclusive basis. We know people have issues with that, and we understand and appreciate that. And one of the ways we think that this will be perhaps worked out in time is the way this is being dealt with in this band. So the notion of the way carriers do their radio resource planning, for example, in the concept of a licensed, exclusively allocated spectrum, if we can work out some of these issues in the CBRS, in the PAL, for example, and can get some general agreement on a very slick framework that we're establishing in SAS, we think that the carriers and other users, not just carriers, but other users of the spectrum, will then begin to see the success that's been established here in the United States, and will see the ability to take it into other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, that's very exciting, because that really can change in a significant way the general framework, also for licensed spectrum. Well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mark, well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been very interesting to hear more about this opportunity.
Well, my pleasure. Very good. And thank you for your questions. It was real fun. Thanks.
And thank you all for listening in. This conversation was part of a report on the 3.5 and the CBRS and the implication for spectrum sharing worldwide. That is written by Sensa Keeley and in collaboration with RC Wireless. Thank you very much.